Hello! Welcome to the Tangent Podcast with Emily and Aleksa. We are so excited to have you with us, and from today, we will be hiring ourselves as the new PR team for maths. My name is Emily, I'm 22, and I'm from South Africa, and I'm studying to be an international maths teacher, alongside my wonderful friend and co-host, Aleksa, who will now tell you a little bit about herself.
Thank you, Emily. As mentioned, my name is Aleksa. I am 20 years old. My parents are from America, but I was born and raised in Dubai before moving to the Netherlands to start university. Emily and I wanted to start this podcast as a way to share what we've learned about the math classroom and to inspire other math educators, or just those who find stuff like this interesting, with interesting topics to discuss in the math classroom. Essentially, we want our podcast to show people the hidden beauty of math.
I'm so excited to be here with you today, Aleksa. And I don't know about you, but the typical response that I get from people when I let them know that I'm becoming a maths teacher is awe at this completely difficult undertaking that my choice of profession is, or they share that they have respect to me, that I believe goes beyond what someone training to be a secondary teacher in any other subject may receive. But then another response I might get is, wow, I hated maths when I grew up. And the polite follow-up of, I'm sure with your personality, the students will love it. We always hear so many classroom horror stories, and it makes me really sad. So many people carry memories of feeling incapable, embarrassed, bored, or simply convinced that mathematics is not for them. I'm terrible at maths, or I'm not a maths person, has somehow become completely normal to say. And as future maths teachers, this is something Aleksa and I really want to challenge. We're not here to convince everybody that to become a mathematician or to be maths teachers themselves, but we just believe that all people deserve to have a positive experience in the mathematics classroom. I hope to be a part of many happy stories in the future where maths is accessible, meaningful, and really, really fun. What do you think, Aleksa?
I completely agree. And I think that it's so funny that you brought that up because I've actually started to keep track of how many people respond to my profession with, oh, wow, I hated math, or, oh, I loved maths in school. And the ratio is really not looking good. And so far, I've only actually had 2 people who say that they enjoyed math while they were at school. And even then, they mentioned that they had a terrible teacher who made them want to drop the subject or not continue it. Some of them had said, oh, I loved math when I was younger, but as I got older, it's just my teachers, they pushed us too hard, or they were so boring, and so I dropped it. And this is where I think that the distinction is important, because often I think that when people say they hate math, what they actually mean is that they had a bad maths teacher. And sometimes, as educators ourselves, we undermine the weight that a good teacher can have on a student's perception of a subject. I think about some of my favorite subjects, and a lot of times it can be accredited to the amazing teacher and the energy that they had in the classroom and how they just made learning come alive. And especially with a subject as particularly complex as mathematics, it's complicated to try and explain to young minds, and a teacher makes just a wild difference.
So I completely agree with you, Aleksa. Teachers really do make all the difference. Something that many great teachers use during their lessons is something called a brain break, where a short structured period of time is dedicated to pause, reset, and prevent cognitive fatigue. In each episode, Aleksa and I will do something short, fun, or interesting before moving on to the next portion of the episode. In future episodes, you can expect games, riddles, debates, recommendations, and so much more. Today, we thought it would be fitting to share some of the parts of mathematics that convinced us to become the willing PR representatives for the subject. So, Aleksa, would you like to tell us a little bit about the parts of maths that you like?
Yeah, I'm excited to. My brain seems to remember numbers better. That hasn't always been the case, but especially the more that I've been learning maths, I've noticed that I can latch on to statistics better. So I love hearing about problems and stats, things like that, and problems that sound or feel counterintuitive. You feel like the answer should be this, but actually when you look at the numbers and you look at the data, you find that the answer is not what you think it is. So riddles and problems where the answer feels so wrong, but you can break it down and explain this is why, and the math just adds up. I just love it because the probability shows that it makes sense. And probability is my least favorite topic, but there's just something about the application of probability to questions that feel so wrong that just make me so interested in the topic and make me want to show that to other people so that they can experience that as well. For example, one of my favorite is 0 to the power of 0. It's my go-to party trick. I'm really fun at parties. You don't need to worry about that. Where the answer doesn't seem to make sense at all. And I'm going to save the answer in case I want to talk about it in a later episode. But the answer just goes so against everything that you've learned from when you were younger to make it, to give you that answer. And really, I actually prefer the pure math side of things. I love proofs. I love looking at the logic behind questions. You can give me 15 questions and I'll do them. It's one of my favorite things to do is just seeing that math work. And working through that step by step, methodically, it makes sense. It works every time. But as I've been preparing to teach and as we're going into our final year, so I've had 3 years of teaching in a classroom already, I've realized that the more that I try and relate to real life problems and I try and connect my content or try and actually, relate things that the students are actively engaging in their day-to-day lives, I've found some really cool connections. And I used to hate that side of things when I was growing up because I just wanted the pure math. But as I've grown older, looking at special problems or situations, which we want to highlight to you in future episodes, I think that it's just, there's so much more to math than just what meets the eye and what is challenging to a lot of people.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Aleksa. I always am so interested to hear about how your brain ticks because I think it ticks in a different way to mine, which makes us collaborating on this podcast particularly exciting. So I also love riddles. Maybe a love for riddles correlates to a love for maths. We might have to do some data collection there. But I love puzzles. I completely adore things like Sudoku puzzles, strategy games, anything that presents a problem where my goal is to solve it. Maybe that says something about me as a person. But maybe it's because of this nature of who I am that I found so much joy in maths topics such as geometry and algebra and patterns and sequences. I always liked that maths was mysterious until it clicked, like an episode of your favorite detective show. In classrooms, in my own learning of mathematics, those moments feel magical when something complicated becomes something comprehensible. And I think maths is so inherently human. We use it to describe a lot of sciences, a lot of things that are happening in our world, and in many ways it can be a description of being human. It was obviously made by humans, and maybe it's the potential English teacher that I could have been, but I view maths as a metaphor for people themselves and the way we perceive our world and other people. We are complicated until we know one another well enough for us to just make sense. And through the following episodes, Aleksa and I hope that we begin to just make sense to you too. So by this metaphor, maths is a system of understanding, which like people and the world, Aleksa and I aim to do our best to understand.
Yeah, I think that's such a great explanation of it as well. They always say that maths is also the universal language, which I love when people say that. But you mentioned that math, there's a moment where it clicks for a lot of people, and that's always the moment as a math teacher that you just like, oh yes, like the students get it. Did you ever have a moment like that from your own math learning experience?
I think that's a lovely question, Aleksa, and upon reflecting on it, I did. In my final year of high school, we were being more explicitly introduced to calculus and the complexities of calculus, and I remember thinking, oh, this is just my least favorite section of mathematics. It just didn't make sense, and there was this struggle, and we'd managed to get through the whole of the unit, and I was still thinking, this doesn't make sense at all. Finding the area under the curve, derivatives, all of that, it was just it was a lot for 18-year-old Emily. And I remember revising for the test, and I was on my own and I was doing past papers. And when it finally clicked in why we were learning derivatives through the context of functions at the time, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not going to completely flunk the calculus section. I wish it was maybe more profound and more meaningful than just as a means to perform better on an assessment, that it was something nicer than that. But it's like a little happy feeling in your stomach, like a little moment of accomplishment. Do you have a moment like that, Aleksa?
I think it's such a difficult question to answer because for me, I can think of multiple moments, not where I remember the content, but where I can remember thinking, that makes sense, or I understand it now. And one specific moment that I remember, I think it was in year 12, so second to last year of high school. And we were also looking at calculus. We were looking at the e to the power of x function. And I think it was you had to derive e to the power of 1. And I sat for hours with my dad, trying to understand why well, maybe not hours, but e to the power of 1 derives to e, or why e derives to e, for example. The function of e stays the same. And I could not figure it out. And then probably about 30 minutes into it, I realized, oh, that's because you've done e to the power of 1. You take that, and then you multiply it by the derivative of 1, which is 1. And I realized that is why it stays the same. And it was literally a moment where it clicked in my brain. I went to my teacher the next day and I said, oh my gosh, is this why this works? Because I knew what the answer was, but I wanted to, again, my brain wanted to know why it worked like that. And he was like, yep, that's exactly why it works. And it was just this moment of accomplishment that I stuck with something until I worked it out.
Thank you so much for that story, Aleksa. I feel that that's representative of the experiences of a lot of students in the maths classroom. And we'd hope for those experiences, but sometimes we don't get those. I think a very common question we get asked in the classroom is, what are we even learning this for? Why do we need to learn algebra? What is the point of this? And sometimes as people, as educators, we get so caught up in all of the maths that we forget what we're learning it for. How is this going to be beneficial to the contemporary student in our classroom, to each individual student? How are they going to be able to apply it to their life? And of course, mathematics, and specifically arithmetic, are really present in our day-to-day lives. We might budget, or we might measure to bake our mom's secret recipe, but maths holds complexities that we're not always thinking about. And learning maths teaches people how to approach problems, break down challenging things, like Aleksa was able to do with her father, and make something manageable, to recognize patterns, to begin to understand things, where we need to have persistence in order to figure out something that's not straightforward. These soft skills are really important to mathematics learning. And I think many people would be floored at how much mathematical thinking we use in our everyday lives, but we just don't notice it. For example, when ensuring that you have enough of your super yummy cake to feed all your friends, or when furnishing your apartment, or when the best deal for shopping is, how to do finances, how investments work. And as teachers, we know we have a responsibility to make applications really visible. Students deserve to know not only what they are learning, but why it matters. So throughout this podcast, Aleksa and I hope to keep sharing why maths is really valuable to everybody and can be done by everybody too.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that especially for those who have stated in the past that they don't like math, I really hope that this podcast does shed some light on, you don't have to love math, but shed some light on actually how you are using math in your day-to-day lives. And I think back to even when I sat in a classroom, and I'm sure, Emily, you felt the same. You sat in the math classroom and thought, when am I ever going to use this in my daily life? You're thinking, when am I ever going to be using, the sine rule and the cosine rule in my day-to-day life. I mean, I'm never, students ask me all the time and they say, I've never used this in my parents have never used this in their real life. They never use this. And I understand that. I think that's a very fair question. And it's one that I asked when I was, in school. And I'm sure that many of our colleagues are also asking, had asked the same question. And it's one that students and even my friends love to throw at me, is like, when are we going to use this? Why am I learning this in school? And I think part of the driving force behind this question is the poor application that teachers are giving to real world problems. You look at textbooks and you're thinking like, these questions, these are not applying to real world problems. They're just using real world items and trying to call that a real world application question. It's just not something that the students are doing. And as teachers, we have this responsibility that we need to help students connect with what they're learning in class to the lifelong skills that they'll use without even realizing it. We want to help make that transition easier for them. And oftentimes, I think what we do as educators is we start with the content and we think, how can I, force a real world problem into this content that I'm trying to teach? And the students will never face it. Whereas I actually think that the better method that we need to do is to take a look at a real world problem and get the students to collaborate on the content that's going to apply. Math education doesn't have to be, today we're going to do Pythagoras, and then we're going to do probability, and then we're going to do this. It's all interconnected. And I think that actually what we need to focus on is also, how are we presenting this application of maths to them? How are we getting them collaborating on it, talking it through? And if you as a teacher believe that math is important in everyday situations, which it is, which we will hopefully show you, then it's also your responsibility to show them how. I think if I show up to a classroom and I'm telling them, all you're going to do today is, calculate the distance of a ladder and a wall. It's like, well, if you're doing that in real life, you're not going to be pulling out your calculator and using sine and cosine. There's other ways that we can apply sort of topics to that. And it does require more effort from our side, for sure. And, teachers already do a lot, and I understand that. But I also think that the effects that you're going to get from putting in this extra effort are just going to improve students' understanding and retention in the long run, even after they've left high school.
I think that is so beautifully said. Thank you, Aleksa. And I'd like to specifically highlight again the system of mathematics, and that perhaps the timetabled nature of education makes us miss that. So it's important that we keep revisiting that maths relates to itself. It relates to other subjects. It relates to English. It relates to art, even if you think it might not. But it does. And I love how you said that the effort will go a long way, because I really think it will. So you are listening to us and you are thinking, this episode's about to conclude. What can I expect next? And I think Aleksa is going to sum up our episode for us.
Yeah. So in today's episode, we've touched briefly on the general attitude towards math and some of our opinions on how this stigma has come about. So in the next couple of episodes, we'll dive deeper into how schools have impacted students' perception of math and how our vision of our own math classroom hopes to change that.
And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Aleksa, for your summary. And we hope that you enjoyed your time with us. And we're looking forward to seeing you in the next episode, where we're going to tackle the question that might ruffle some feathers. Did school accidentally make students hate maths? Thank you for joining us. And we can't wait to see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.